Hey everyone, Unblocked is a bi-monthly event series where guests are asked questions in an AMA-style format, focusing on questions relevant to early-stage startups and blockchain technology. Unblocked is sponsored by DLab, a startup accelerator and venture studio that sits within the SOSV family. You can find out more at www.dlab.vc. We hope you enjoy the conversation. So Christina and Cecilia, I'm super excited to have you guys on, and I'm super interested to hear about the efforts UNICEF has in the blockchain space. But it would be great if we could start by having you introduce yourselves to everybody here.
Sure, so I can start. Thanks for having us. So I'm Christina. I lead our blockchain team within the Office of Innovation at UNICEF. I work with Cecilia on the fund, which we'll talk to you about, so around our investments and helped launch the crypto fund. Our team also builds internal prototypes for UNICEF, working with our country offices around the world. And we also have some learning initiatives around educating young people around blockchain and also collaborating with our colleagues within the UN.
So I'm Cecilia. I'm an advisor for the Office of Innovation within UNICEF. It's basically a division at UNICEF that focuses on exploring how frontier technologies can benefit children. And there, I basically manage the investment sourcing strategy for the investments we make from UNICEF's venture fund. I manage the selection process, and I advise on the portfolio of investments across the crypto fund and the venture fund.
Really cool. So, like before I joined SOSV, I only thought of UNICEF as an organization that kind of distributed aid, but it didn't occur to me that UNICEF had a venture arm. And so, could you give an overview as to what the venture arm is and what's its thesis, generally speaking? Because I'm not sure most people are aware that UNICEF does something like that.
Yeah, for sure. So UNICEF's venture fund is basically a 30 million pooled funding vehicle, which is focused on constantly identifying, piloting, and growing open source frontier tech startups. So by frontier tech startups, we basically refer to those that can impact more than 1 billion people and lie in $100 billion markets, meaning that these are the kinds of technologies and projects that can impact a large group of people, but can also be financially sustainable. So they wouldn't depend on the long run from support from UNICEF. So we particularly focus in 4 technology areas. These are extended reality, data science and AI, drones, and certainly blockchain. So throughout the year, we issue different what we call for applications, trying to identify projects around these technologies that have the potential to improve the lives and well-being of children around the world.
Sorry, I was on mute. So it's my understanding you invest in companies that were created in these markets, correct? Like you're not investing in US companies. You're investing in a company maybe in Kenya or whatever those emerging markets are. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we focus on developing and emerging countries. So these are what we call UNICEF program countries. So countries where UNICEF has an office and a mandate to support the development of that country. So more specifically, we focus on the most vulnerable populations and how to use these frontier technologies to create solutions that can improve those areas. And a big part of the focus of our investments is making sure that we invest in local teams within those areas. As many times we mentioned, you can build the best blockchain solution in the US, but it may not work in, for example, Kenya, just because it's a different ecosystem, there's a different infrastructure, and so on. So we want to make sure that we empower the local people in that country that know the ecosystem of that geographic location, that have partnerships, that have the relationships, that understand the problem inside out, and are building a solution with that kind of deep inside knowledge.
And so how old is the fund and how many investments have you made so far?
So the fund has been operating for about 8 years. We have made about 100 investments. We actually just reached to the 100 milestone. We've made 100 investments in 56 countries. The way it works, so the way our strategy works is every year we open calls for applications in which startups are encouraged to apply, and in every call effort, so to say, we focus in one specific technology of our focus technology areas and a certain use cases and applications that we're particularly interested in. So right now, for example, we have an open call for applications for blockchain solutions with a deadline on the 26th of July. And we're particularly looking forward to encouraging people to apply before the deadline so that we can review and make a new set of investments around blockchain applications.
And so what type of stage are the companies you guys are investing in? My assumption is that it's very early stage, but
yeah,
would be curious here.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So we invest in projects that are in startups that are very early stage. So what we ask at the moment of the application is that they need to have a prototype, essentially some evidence that indicates that their solution has potential and that the vision that they're presenting of what the solution and what they want to do actually can happen. So this can be shown by the skills and the experience from the team members that are applying, by their understanding of the local context, as I was saying before, by history on the partnerships that they have established today, by the work with local partners, or of course, by evidence of impact, by their experience serving users in that local ecosystem and testing their technology to kind of indicate what stage are they at. But yeah, they're very early stage, and we invest in them. After we invest in them, they basically join this 1-year portfolio experience where we support them to grow from the prototype stage into strengthening their minimum viable product and get more investment ready.
It's really cool. And so within this venture arm, UNICEF has been very proactive in the blockchain space. So I'd be interested to hear that sort of the history behind it. How did UNICEF sort of fall in love with crypto? When did this start coming to fruition? And when did you start sort of making your first venture investments in the blockchain space?
Sure. So we made our first blockchain investment several years ago. If memory serves me, it was 2017 was our first investment into a South African blockchain company. And it was just one company that we invested into. But as Cecilia mentioned, we typically invest in cohorts of companies. And so our first big investment into blockchain companies was in December of 2018, where we invested into 6 blockchain companies who were working on a variety of different use cases in different countries. And they started that cohort experience. So they actually came to New York. We did a 1-week workshop with them where we really kicked off and accelerated all of the mentorship with the open source mentors, the business mentors, a whole bunch of folks from the blockchain ecosystem, and then started those monthly check-ins. Those companies have just graduated from the fund, some of them receiving follow-on funding, which we're really excited about. But I would say that's kind of where our blockchain work started, though our team internally has been prototyping with blockchain since as early as 2015, which was our first blockchain prototype. So we really have this model where we have this amazing fun team we get to work with, and Cecilia really leading that from the blockchain front, and then having this internal team who looks at how we as an organization can use blockchain. And we really look at that around 3 different ways blockchain can play a role in our work. One being, can we redistribute resources in a new way? And our most recently launched crypto fund is a good example of that. And I can talk about that in a second. The second would be, can we be more transparent and efficient in our processes? And so that's something that we would work with our country offices. For example, we're working in UNICEF Kazakhstan right now around vendor management and payment, and if we can make that more efficient and transparent. And last is, can we use blockchain to incentivize the creation of digital public goods? So you can think of things like different token models or digital rewards and things like that using blockchain. How can we explore those? So those are kind of the three pillars that we look at. Sorry, Paul, we can't hear you.
I'm on mute again. So you spoke about the crypto fund, and my reading on it is that it's crypto denominated, or part of it is crypto denominated. So I'd like some, which is unclear to me. Are you holding like DAI or something, or Bitcoin? I'm curious as to know what crypto denominated means.
Sure. So crypto denominated means that we're making investments in Bitcoin or Ether. So we can accept donations in crypto, and we can also make investments. So we essentially took the venture fund model that Cecilia talked about that's been around for many years and said, instead of doing this using US dollars, can we instead do this using Bitcoin or Ether? And so that means that not only are they receiving crypto, but the contract is denominated in crypto itself. And we're transparently tracking and showing to the public funds coming in and funds going out. This was a process that took us about 2 years to get to the point to being able to do this. It's the first crypto denominated fund within the UN. And so we're really excited about that.
What's been the experience so far, like dealing with traditional fiat currency versus dealing with crypto? What have you learned? What's been great? What's been sort of a pain?
Yeah, so I think that there's this misconception out there that the second that you use crypto, everything is faster and easier, because all of these things disappear. That's really not the case when you're using it from an institutional perspective. We still have our processes and procedures that we need to follow. So there was a lot of upfront work around figuring out what that looked like using digital assets. And now that we have that set up and we've gone through that journey, some of the things that we're immediately seeing that are different would be the speed at which we can make the transaction. So in our most recent round of investments, which was just a few weeks ago, we made 8 investments into companies in 7 different countries. And we were able to do that in under 20 minutes for under $20. And that was a total investment amount of about $225,000. And so just the speed and the transparency at which we could do it is definitely something new and something that we're exploring from a crypto fund perspective.
And so could you speak a little bit about like the crypto investments you've made, like the use cases, I guess, if you can't name them publicly, and like why you're excited about them?
Yeah, I'll take that question. So we're very excited for multiple reasons. One of the main things that was exciting with our last round of investment that included 8 companies was that we didn't only invest in blockchain companies, we also invested in virtual and augmented reality companies and also companies working on data science and AI. So for many of them, while it wasn't their first interaction with blockchain, it was definitely the first time they were like actively part of that ecosystem, actively receiving crypto, holding crypto, and dispersing like funds in crypto to basically either develop features of their solution or testing their solution with more users. So it was just very exciting to see new companies getting into the space and benefiting from it. So this last round of investments, it was also interesting because it included a lot of different programmatic areas, from connectivity to education, food delivery, even mental health and accessibility. And to give you a couple of examples, they were all really related to solving challenges related to COVID-19. So a lot of the companies are currently in the situation where they're iterating on their solutions to respond to the new demands. And basically these 8 investments we made were related to how could these companies improve and iterate on the efforts to react to the current circumstances. So one of the companies, basically, their name is Statwick. They're a blockchain company based in India. So they they work on improving improving the tracking of supply chain processes so that they can better track the different efficiencies and inefficiencies within the supply chain of food and vaccine delivery. And during COVID, they actually partnered with the Indian government to track the delivery of food to a low-income village in India, and making sure that they were making the most of the food that was being delivered and the waste was reduced to a maximum. So they tracked the delivery of 100 million bags of rice. They also have previously tracked the delivery of vaccines, more than 1 million vaccines. So that's just very interesting to think about that application in the world moving forward, being vaccines such a priority right now. Another of the examples is Sombleng. So they're actually a company that have an interactive voice response platform in Cambodia. And they were previously using to send key information to the population. But during COVID, they also partnered with the government to send key messages to as much people as possible in the country related to self-isolation, social distancing, hygiene. And during the first month of the COVID situation, they had an increase of 1 million voice calls. And they had to support this kind of increase in demand. And the crypto funding was specifically meant to the development of new features for them to cope and be able to respond to this increase of demand. Another of the examples is OS City. So OS City is a Mexican company, but they're actually very present throughout Latin America. They work on using blockchain. As Christina was saying, one of the main applications we're interested in is transparency. So they use a blockchain-based platform to give more transparency around the use of public funding. So I think a lot of people in the world sometimes want to know how are public funds being utilized. So one of the things they do is, for example, track and give more visibility around the use of subsidies and how is that money implemented. So that's a bit of a sneak peek.
No, that's really cool. I guess a question I had was, how does UNICEF sort of view blockchain? Like, how do you own like tokens? Do you invest in companies that have their own tokens? How do you feel about the whole public and private chain debate? And I guess, how do you see the future of blockchain? Like, do you see it as a multi-protocol future? Where do you see sort of the technology going over the next 5 to 10 years as well?
Yeah, so when we're making investments, we're platform agnostic. So we have no preference in terms of what people are building on. As anyone in the blockchain space would know, there's still a long way to go in terms of making it more generally accessible. And so we really we make investments into applications for local communities, and that's really our focus area. In terms of one platform over another, we really don't look at one being the one that will succeed. There will probably be multiple platforms that will succeed, and you see different enterprises and groups around the world really making that statement that it's not going to be one platform that we use for everything. So I think interoperability between platforms is really important. One of the tenets of our venture fund and crypto fund is that we only invest into open source startups. And so that kind of matches really well with working on blockchain products and making sure that in the future, whatever is built really is interoperable and usable within a larger community.
And so I guess when you're investing in open source projects, because there's a lot of founders on the call, and some of them have open source projects themselves, and the question is always, how do you monetize an open source project? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to give any type of blanket statement as it pertains to open source, but working with an open source mentor for us has really been successful for the startups that we work with. So we have some really awesome open source mentors who will work with the startups one-on-one to look at what their business model is around their product and how that can become sustainable. We've seen obvious benefits of working in open source. One would be the community that's not only built and fostered when you're building open source, but the resources that you have access to. So you have access to some of the best developers in the world who you might otherwise not be able to afford or be able to work with. And being open source grants you that opportunity. There's also the benefit of when we're doing these cohort investments, because it's 4 to 6 to 8 startups working on similar technologies, they have components from one another that they can leverage, and we've seen that through our investments that they actually do collaborate quite a bit. So those are some of the easy benefits of building open source.
And so Sorry, no, didn't mean to interrupt.
Sorry. Just to add to that, I think there's a bit of a misconception out there. I think like many people think like, oh, if it's open source, it's free, and we actually get that question a lot. Like, so I'm supposed to keep my solution for free, and they're really, really different things. Surely you can charge for the service for the product that you produced. Open source is just a very different thing. And as Christina said, there are multiple benefits, and you can also think about the way your solution can expand. If we see that UNICEF, we want a successful solution in Argentina to be as quickly as possible, if successful, be replicated in other countries, and that's certainly much easier if it's open source. That interoperability is simply easier to take to other places from within UNICEF with our networks and the support that we enable to do that.
And so since you're dealing with in emerging markets, and I believe SEMPO was a referral from you all, and one thing that they brought to my attention was immediately clear to me was that the people that live in these places are often illiterate, but that applies to letters. But I didn't realize, which makes sense now, but I didn't realize it applies to numbers as well, because when SEMPO would give them a PIN, for example, it would just type 0000 or 11111. So I guess a question I had related to that is how, because of course blockchain is notoriously hard to use, but even for the normal person, and even more so for somebody who's illiterate. So how, because UNICEF is investing in these sort of jurisdictions, how does UNICEF think about sort of the usability factor of blockchain?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to break this question down into a couple of components. So like we do invest in emerging markets and developing countries, and maybe when thinking about emerging markets, these are actually like the larger growing economies like India and China that are basically leaders in this space. I think, if I'm not wrong, like China is the country that has the largest amount of initiatives around blockchain, and the government is adopting blockchain on a national level. So there's definitely a growing population there that is very much interested and kind of ready for that space to continue developing further. Then of course there's developing countries where they may be further behind in terms of the adoption of blockchain applications. I guess in general, if you compare them with North America and Western Europe, they basically tend to lack the technological infrastructure to enable the same level of technology development as in the developed world. But we also see progress. We see that there's multiple projects. There's usually growing ecosystems around the use of blockchain applications, even around blockchain for good. We actually, we now have an open call for applications. We have, I think at this point, we're still 2 weeks away from the deadline, and around like 130 projects that are coming from these countries have applied. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of potential to grow these solutions. But that is also the reason why from UNICEF we want to help grow these ecosystems around the needs and the applications that we think are especially relevant for improving society. And I guess like I think an important thing in terms of the technological infrastructure is like we do definitely see we definitely see a gap in the technology infrastructure that is present in developing countries. And that is why another sub-team within the innovation team where Christina and I sit on is steering the development of a new project called Giga that is about connecting every school to the internet. So just fostering the ecosystem, allowing connectivity access that again would help plug these solutions on top of that infrastructure much better.
That's really cool. And so, I'd like to end with, I'd be remiss to not talk about, with the world economy kind of grinding to a halt. We've seen governments around the world do a large amount of stimulus, and in some cases sending money directly to their citizens, which has given the rise to this whole talk of CBDCs, which I think personally we need a better name than CBDCs. But I wanted to get your thoughts on the discussion around CBDCs and what your thoughts are, generally speaking.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about the crypto fund and what we've done to date, which is really be able to work with digital assets, hasn't been us trying to promote any type of cryptocurrency one over the other. What it is a recognition from us that the world is changing. We're moving more online. A lot more services are digital, and we need to prepare ourselves as an organization for how we adapt and we change. UNICEF is a over 70-year-old organization that works in over 190 countries around the world, and we do some really critical work from child protection to vaccine delivery and things like that. Our team, the innovation team, is really meant to look at what are the possible futures that could affect the way that UNICEF does our work. And we then go on and do explorations and learnings that we can bring back to the rest of the organization. I think the crypto fund, and particularly related to CBDC, is a good example of that. We've had this new set of conversations around what it means to operate in a digitally financed future, whether that be a cryptocurrency, a CBDC, a fiat, whatever it might be in the future, not really placing our bets on any of those, but really getting a ton of learning right now so that we can adapt as the ecosystems we work in adapt and grow.
That's really cool. And so, I see. So I guess, do you guys feel like there's something there with CBDCs, or is it just kind of a buzzword at the moment? Because, it is kind of the hot topic of the day, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of research to be done, and we'll wait and see what happens.
Yeah, fair enough. So I guess, how did each of you, what was your first moment when you interacted with the blockchain application, when you realized, because of course I'm sure you did a lot of reading and studying on the topic, but I'm curious if you interacted with an application, whether it was built on Ethereum or something else, where you've really, the kind of light bulb went off and you realized that there was some vast potential here with blockchain technology.
I can start. So for me, I've been looking at crypto and blockchain since 2013, 2014. So I don't know that there was one particular aha moment that I had that kind of the light bulb went off, because it was a learning process for me. I started by just learning about what crypto was, because that's all that people talked about back in 2013, 2014. And then I wrote my master thesis on blockchain and how that was being adopted in large organizations. And that's where I started to understand some of the potentials it could have. I would say where I started to see the impact and the shift and the conversation change a little bit was I then went on to work in a consulting firm where I worked with various levels of government who were looking to use blockchain. And the fact that no one entity actually owned the technology really opened up a door to have a new set of conversations around the table. Because the previous conversation was that, groups have a hard time collaborating because there's this element, of mistrust, using a super wide definition of mistrust here around how do you ensure that you have full access? How do you ensure that it's governed a way that you like? And blockchain having this element of decentralization, depending on how it's set up, public versus hybrid, really opened the door for conversation. So even if blockchain didn't end up being the solution that they used at the end of the day, because quite frankly, blockchain isn't always the right solution and shouldn't be, the solution of choice all the time. You should have conversations around whether it's one viable technology versus another. What it did enable was a group of people to come around the table and have a conversation around new ways of working together. And I think that in and of itself is extremely powerful.
So on my end, it was a bit different. So I come from a background in the private sector and moved into the social sector just because I was so passionate into using the private sector mentality and operations kind of work to solve social problems. And it was quite some while ago that I started working with technology startups, and I realized that there were still a lot of inefficiencies in the way social development conducts some of their projects, and especially related to, as Christina was saying, a little bit of mistrust from the general population, or maybe a lack of transparency, but mostly because the same applications didn't allow for that. So really, it was about 5 years ago that I started exploring different applications, and how could we use technology to give more transparency to people, and allow people to track essentially the kinds of projects they support. So that's why that's what sparked the interest in blockchain technology. Those are the applications that I'm mostly passionate about, and I think there's still room for development and improving the way these applications work, and how do we provide more transparency through the use of the solutions that we invest in. But I think we've made a lot of progress around this area, and it's just fascinating to see how the mindset has changed. How can someone support a social cause or support an investment and really get the inside out of how is that money utilized, even faster than the 1-year report that they get as a result. So the tracking goes not only into the financial metrics that are pretty much standardized, but also around social metrics, or around the development of that technology that can be tracked throughout its implementation.
Do you think being Argentinian and like the economic sort of difficulties that the country's gone through over the past 30 or so years are well documented, but do you think being Argentinian made you predisposed to liking blockchain technology or thinking positively on it?
So, yeah, Argentina is a country that has had a 30% poverty level. I think now we're getting closer to even 40%. So, of course, I think yes, my passion for social development was very aligned with the situation of the country where I grew up, knowing that the poverty levels were so high, and also knowing that social development was hard to support, because I think it's very common for people to think, if I support that project, where does the money go, or what happens after? So I think this level of, again, like being able to much more properly track and get access to the way that project uses its funding, it's really fascinating. So there's definitely a connection there.
That makes sense. So we're going to move to the Q&A. If anybody has any questions, just feel free to dump them in either the chat or the Q&A. I guess the first question from Alex: Does UNICEF's crypto fund work on blockchain projects with organizations like IBM's Disaster and Relief CSR arm?
Yeah, so we do work on projects with other groups. Typically, that's with our other UNICEF colleagues. So we have offices in over 190 countries. While Cecilia and I work in headquarters, there are amazing colleagues in country offices delivering programmatic work. And so we often work with those country offices who want to explore, for example, blockchain technology, and how that might work. We also take part in projects across the UN as well. So we have worked with other UN entities such as the World Food Program and the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, on a project called the Atrium. And this is a project to foster collaboration and learning around blockchain within the UN. It helps us figure out how do we set up a private blockchain network, set up nodes between entities and things like that. And so it's really looking at the various initiatives that are going on in the ecosystem and which ones we can support. We're a very, very small team of people who work on this technology, obviously really passionate about it. And we do have those primary areas that I mentioned earlier around where we're trying to explore where blockchain can have some benefits. And of course, supporting the innovation team at large. Cecilia talked about the Giga project around bringing universal connectivity to school communities, and then also UNICEF initiatives. So we do work with outside groups sometimes, but it really depends on what we're working on at the moment.
And an anonymous attendee asks, how do you feel about Libre?
Yeah, no particular way. I guess it's the exact same response that I had earlier around CBDCs. It's really early to have any type of opinion on any type of digital currency, digital asset, and we really look at this from an exploratory lens in terms of how can we as an organization learn and understand what's going on in the ecosystem.
What specific applications or use cases do you feel are under addressed in the blockchain space? Are there specific topics that you're hoping to be able to address through funding startups in your target markets?
I can mention a little bit and then I'll probably hand it over to Cecilia as well. For specifically the blockchain call that we currently have out, there are 4 areas that we're looking at in terms of prototypes, but it's not just limited to those. So we typically give buckets that we have some type of interest in, but if a really solid project comes in that is not in those buckets, we absolutely encourage everyone working on blockchain projects who are eligible for funding to apply. We'd love to see your application. Some of those buckets include things like there's a bucket called finance, which is a very, very broad bucket. So any type of, I think DeFi is the buzzword going around these days in terms of decentralized financial applications that, get a larger group of people to have access to various types of services. So that's definitely one. There's another bucket around data. Obviously, data is so critical in so many contexts, but there's also an element of data privacy. And so looking at solutions who might be using blockchains, maybe for a decentralized oracle for some type of data or some type of element of data privacy, that would be another bucket. There's also a bucket around, we call it Connect, and this is looking at different ways to get communities to interact with one another. So this might be, for example, a decentralized marketplace. This might be a DAO that's in the community that makes decisions, for example. And then the last bucket is Empower. And this is once you have some of those fundamental things that help really the community run and organize, how can you give them an additional kind of boost or other tools to work on top of that base infrastructure that's been established. So an example of this would be micro work, for example. Is there some way that using blockchain applications, you can get individuals to contribute to micro tasks and get some type of remuneration for that specifically? Those are our 4 buckets for this call specifically, but as I mentioned, we encouraged everyone to apply. Cecilia, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that was a great summary. I would only add that from the last round of investments we just made around the different technology was actually data science and AI. It was funny that the startup that was ultimately selected, the announcement came in a couple of days ago. So they told us, we were very surprised that you invested in us because we read that you from UNICEF, you're working already in this same thing that we're doing. So they thought because of that, they wouldn't be selected because we were already working on that. And I think our approach is just the opposite. We are interested in specific areas, just like Christina mentioned, and we're looking for collaboration. We're looking to collaborating with different partners. We have a very large market that we serve, a lot of countries in the world, and we're basically looking for solutions that are working on these areas. These are still experimental areas. So even if you see we have a startup or we have a project working on transparency, working on tracking, working on finance. There's still not enough strength and not enough evidence in those sectors. So we're looking for more startups, more solutions around those areas, or even new ones.
Next question is, what are your thoughts about traceability solutions using blockchain together with monetary shared incentive programs for families that commit to work with NGOs to avoid hazardous child labor? Very specific question. I can repeat it. It's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, I think that would require a little bit more time than what we have right now. I think that applications that work on helping transparency are good initiatives. I think we need to balance that in terms of what actually is possible with end mile solutions, because blockchain doesn't solve everything. We can't digitize everything. So, we often see that some of the strongest blockchain use cases is where the entire use case end to end is digital. But the second that, it's trying to track, a person who's done a physical delivery, there's then an IoT device or a scanner that has to be incorporated into that overall supply chain. Things start to get a little bit more complex, a little bit more difficult. So it's really analyzing, where the benefits are in those use cases.
Can you talk a bit about your approach to blockchain training? What have you found to be effective in training new development talent in these markets? Or is this primarily the job of program offices or partners?
Yeah, so we have a series of programs that are really great, led by our country offices and our other colleagues around, skill development and upskilling and things like that. Our team, specifically as it pertains to blockchain, has worked on two things. One is we have a series called Surge, which is a series of learning days and hackathons. We've run that in about 5 countries at this point, and it will be moving online now. So there'll be an online version in the fall. This is typically working with young people who, some of them have never heard of blockchain before. Some of them have coding experience. So we really, when we've done these in person in the past, have worked with the local country office to then identify local groups who might be interested in learning about blockchain. Sometimes this is through coding schools, sometimes this is through after school groups and things like that. We have brought the technology, like the laptops or mobile devices, for individuals to actually be able to engage with the technology. Not everyone that we've taught blockchain to has access to a personal computer at home. And we really start with the basics. So what is blockchain and how does it work? We have hands-on games that we used to use in terms of simulating a blockchain that we've developed and iterated on. And then I would say the other thing that's worked really well and is powerful is bringing groups from the community to actually talk to those individuals. We're really there just to be a convener and to help bring people together. What we really want is to create a sustainable network and ecosystem with the folks that we're working with, so that when we're no longer there, they still know who to reach out to. For example, we did this in Cape Town in South Africa, where at the end of the learning day, and throughout the day, there were multiple people who came and presented. It wasn't just us. Actually, it was barely us. It was mostly community groups. But the closing session was, you've now learned about what blockchain is. What do you do next? And we had several people from the local Cape Town community come in and give talks about either accelerators who focused on blockchain or meetup groups that were in the local area, local resources that they could easily have access to so that they could continue their blockchain learning. With the ultimate goal of Cecilia and I hoping that these people who learn about blockchain would be interested in pursuing some type of solution, solving a local challenge, and then would be eligible to the venture fund or the crypto fund. That would be the ideal scenario.
So there's a couple questions in here, and I guess some people are a little bit confused about, one company is, our company HQ is based in Europe, but the operation is based in ASEAN and China to help on SME financial inclusion. Would our company fit in your investment criteria? And another related question, would you invest in, for example, a U.S. tech startup solving water scarcity in Africa?
So yeah, that's a very common question we get a lot. I think what is important to know is like first we have um the basically operational focus of investing in startups that are being built and developed in developing and emerging countries. China is one example, Mexico, of course, another. Um, so you could have multiple registrations. So maybe you're registered also in the US or also in Europe, as long as you have a registration in that other country, you can apply. Just bear in mind that throughout the selection process and the due diligence that we do, we really want to see that you understand that local context, that you are um, working in that emerging or developing country, that you have a local team. Um, because, of course, I think now we know that it's not just about the idea that you may have, like you need to have an understanding of the local network, of the local infrastructure, of the local challenges, the problems, the needs that you're facing, the people that you're serving. So it's not always so easy to say like yes you're eligible or no. Yes, you do need that local registration in that developing or emerging country, but you also need to show us all those other things, and it's basically a package where we analyze all those different points.
I guess the last question I had was: has COVID-19 changed how you view how you're making investments, the pace of your investments, or just the types of companies that all of a sudden are interesting to you?
It was interesting. So Christina and I had the plan to open this call for blockchain applications. I think in March this year, and yes, when COVID-19 happened, we realized we couldn't open the call for applications that we were intending at that moment. We had a lot of different challenges that we had to face, and we just needed to understand what those were. So we did postpone the blockchain call until the situation was at least a bit more stable, or we understood what we were facing. I think in March everything was even more unknown than it is here, than it is now. And we decided instead to do this round of investments purely from the crypto fund perspective, that focused on giving funding to companies that have already been invested previously from the innovation fund, and that were part of our basically alumni network. So what we did is we did an assessment and open like a call specific for alumni companies, and we made a round of investments around the technologies that were addressing challenges related to COVID. So that's how we selected these 8 companies that, as I mentioned before, are either expanding their platform and developing new features to be able to cope with calls that refer to COVID messaging, or they're piloting, like I said, in India, a new solution with a government partner to deliver food, just because supply chains have been very much affected. So yes, our plans changed, our priorities changed, and I'm happy that we were able to very quickly address those, and at least do something from our end, from the funding perspective and the fund we have, that was helpful for those initiatives.
We had one more question come in, and I think the question is: if we are working on financial solutions that help families in Mexico, this is a secondary benefit to children. Is this benefit to children strong enough to be considered? I would imagine it's kind of, the answer is kind of like the devil's in the details, right?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very easy answer. We do get that question also a lot. What we evaluate is potential to improve the lives of children. Like, surely, if you are improving the life of families, if you're increasing the income, or if you're supporting the increase of an income or creating a job opportunity for the household income makers, you're definitely improving the opportunities and the choices that the children in those families will have. You're empowering, in the larger view, like a community to move forward and grow the economy in that specific location. So the relationship doesn't have to be direct. So for example, children don't have to be the direct users of your platform, we basically evaluate if there's any connection in terms of the world those children live in, and will that be improved?
Great.
Um,
Sorry, Christina.
I was just going to say, I think sometimes it's easier for people to understand what might fall under that category of eligibility in terms of impact by looking at our past investments. So we have both a crypto fund website, which is cryptofund.unicef.io, or the innovation fund website, which is unicefinnovationfund.org, if I'm not mistaken. And you can go and look at our past investments to just give you a quick idea of the 6 that we made in blockchain companies last time. Those ranged from everything from digital prescriptions to impact funding to remote connectivity to vaccine supply chain and so on. And so in all of those cases, there's no, direct, child or young person in that, but it's the overall larger benefit to society and then ultimately to children. So taking a look at past investments is really helpful, I find, as it pertains to figuring that out.
Great. So we're over time, and I wanted to thank you guys both for coming on. It's been great to learn more and hear about your efforts. I always end this, but how can we, as a community, be helpful to you all?
I think sharing the call for applications would be the most immediate thing. We're always looking for great projects. So as much as anyone who might be interested in it, we'd super appreciate you sharing those details and the opportunity. It's not just about blockchain. Blockchain is the call for applications that we have right now, but to keep an eye out on our social media, because we are very open about the work that we're working on. So if there's something that interests you, feel free to reach out to us. And then there's also other calls for different technologies in the future to keep an eye out.
And I would only add that, we work hard to support these startups going forward. There are definitely more follow-on funding and more support opportunities for blockchain and other frontier tech startups in developed markets. There are not as many opportunities in the developing world. So if you do also have any opportunity available and you want to reach out to either us to share that opportunity, or you want to reach out to our startups, we're always very happy to collaborate with different organizations that kind of want to support them moving forward, either if it's on funding or to do a pilot in a new area or to explore something together.
Great.
That'd be great as well.
Yeah, of course. We're happy to help. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Christina and Cecilia. It's been a real pleasure to speak. Certainly been enlightening for me, and look forward to chatting again sometime soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.